during Charlie's trial, the government had all sorts of tapes on Fred Taylor, and Fred was a very smart guy.
Oh, he was.
Streetwise, Fred was very smart. He was a highway patrolman who was attached. Actually, his duties were nobody knew what Fred's duties were.
It was basically take care of Gene Blanton.
He basically was Gene Blanton, the governor's brother's driver.
Driver, that's what it was.
But anyway, Fred goes down to Memphis and meets with this guy named Art Baldwin.
I forgot about this guy.
And Baldwin owned strip clubs in Memphis, and Fred was basically selling pardons, and Baldwin, unbeknownst to Fred, was an FBI informant. And when Fred would go down there, of course, Baldwin would get Fred drunk and they'd tape everything.
Clarify that about him being the FBI informant. He got it the hard way, okay?
Yeah.
Because the FBI had busted him on a whole kind of stuff. So he was working for his own self.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? He wasn't a Mr. Do-Gooder. Okay,
no. Art Baldwin.
No, Baldwin. He was a slum flea bite.
He had all sorts of problems.
Yeah.
And so Fred, they were taping Fred one day, and Fred,
this is a classic.
And they played the tape in our trial. They'd cut the lights out and play the tapes for days. And on one of the tape, Fred, there was a guy named Ernest Withers, and he was a state representative from Memphis, or was it J.P. Speedy Morrell?
Ernest, I think, was the state representative. Right. Morrell was the fixer.
Yeah, Morrell was the black fixer from Memphis. Yeah. And he would come up and literally go in Blanton's office and sit in Blanton's chair and put his feet up on the desk. And Baldwin says to Taylor one day on tape, he said, what is this deal with J.P. Speedy Morrell, or Speedy Morrell, that he can do these kind of things? And Fred says, I don't know. He said, I think he caught the governor fucking a goat. and of course that, the jury went crazy. Everybody laughed. But they had Fred pretty well nailed.
Oh, there was no question about it.
And so we get into the trial, and there'd been this woman named Marie Regente. And Marie Regente, as I remember it, and you correct me, but had been a cocktail waitress when Blanton was running for governor. And she was a good-looking woman.
I think she'd also be involved in little politics around Nashville.
Local politics or whatever.
Yeah.
Anyway, she sort of went to work for the Blanton campaign. Well, after the Blanton campaign, Eddie Sis got her a job. And of course, Eddie was fucking her. And I'll never forget the first time I ever saw her. I was in Newport, and I was practicing law in Newport, but I had gone to Memphis to an attorney general's conference. And Eddie and Charlie were there, and I walk in the room and I'm talking to Charlie, and she walks by. And I said, my God, who is that? And you said, you leave her alone, that's Eddie's private stock.
Yes,
I never will forget
I totally did
that.
That's crazy.
And turns out she later, as I appreciated, she and Eddie had this affair, and she demanded of Eddie that he leave his wife.
The oldest story in the world.
And Eddie wouldn't do it, and so they had to get her out of the office.
Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, right?
So instead of just firing her, these idiots promoted her and gave her the chairmanship of the Board of Pardons and Paroles.
That's a good way of putting it. Well, I agree with you.
That? And so she's pissed, and she calls the FBI. And that's what started.
That's what started
the whole investigation.
Yeah.
So at our trial, she comes in to testify. Now, at that point in time, she's represented by this little fellow named Fred Thompson. And Fred is her civil lawyer.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll never forget her coming in to testify. And I know this woman's background. I know she's fucked everybody on Capitol Hill. Except and me.
They won't have nothing to do with that woman.
But she was ready to get us a good fucking.
Yeah. Well, not physically speaking.
Yeah. So the judge has already told me that I cannot get into her sexual proclivities, which was probably the right call. But she comes in the courtroom to testify against Charlie, and she's got a dress on.
She has her Mother Teresa garb on.
It's up around her neck. She's got her hair.
School mom.
She's got her hair up in a bun, and she's still a good-looking woman. I mean, and she testifies, and I cross-examine her, and right at the end of the cross-examination, you could sort of see that the women didn't like her, or at least that was my impression. And I sat down and I asked the judge, I said, "Judge, can I get back up and just ask a couple of more questions that I've forgotten?" And he said, "You may." And I got up and I said, "Ms. Rajante, I understand that you're writing a book about this case and all of this." And she, I'll never forget, she grabbed her collar and turned and looked at the jury and said, "No, a book is being written about me." And I just couldn't resist. I said, "Well, is it fiction or non-fiction?"
Non-fiction, yeah.
And the prosecutor jumped up and objected. Yeah. And I said, "I withdraw the question because everybody in this room already knows the answer." And I turned around and looked at Fred. He was sitting back in the audience. And after the trial was over and we had won, they made a movie about her. And the guy that wrote Serpico wrote a book about her. What was his name? Peter Moss.
Moss, yeah, that's him.
And everybody, when they made the movie about her, everybody went down and tried out for their parts in the movie. I went down and tried out for my part. And Fred Thompson tried out for his part. And he got his part. And later, obviously, became a U.S. Senator and a movie star. And I told him one day, I said, "Fred," and I like Fred, and I always did. I said, "Fred, there is no justice in this world. I won this case. You weren't even in the case. I had to go back to Newport, Tennessee and try lawsuits. You got to go to Hollywood. I'm a better lawyer than you are, and I look better than you do. There is no justice in this world." And Fred just laughed. I mean, Fred was a good guy. He was. I like Fred Thompson. Going back to the trial. I think the most damaging witness to us was the janitor. What was his name?
Arthur Brandon.
Arthur Brandon.
Yeah, Arthur Brandon.
Arthur Brandon was, in the government's case, I think the most damaging witness to us was the head janitor at the Capitol. And Arthur Arthur testified that on numerous occasions he had taken Charlie money for pardons and paroles. And after Arthur testified,
I was just going to say, his testimony was devastating until you cross-examined him.
Yeah. But before I cross-examined, after he testified on direct, and before I cross-examined him, we took a recess, and
Yes.
Judge Churchill called me and the prosecutors back into his office. And Judge Churchill looked at me and he said, "Mr. Ball," he said, "after that testimony, it's obvious your client is guilty." And he said, "The Sixth Circuit has sent me down here to try this case. And if you lose this case, you're going to have to appeal. And if I get anywhere close to being right, the Sixth Circuit's going to uphold my decisions." And he said, "I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to end this trial today, and your client's going to plead guilty, and I'm going to give him 5 years. The same as I'm going to give Mr. Sisk and Mr. Taylor when I sentence them.
But if he doesn't?
But if he doesn't, I'm going to give him 40 years. And that was pretty strong, you know. And I go out and tell Charlie, and to Charlie's credit, and this is, I don't know that I could have made that call, but to Charlie's credit, he told me, he said, "I am not going to ever plead guilty, one, to something I didn't do, and two, in front of my kids." And I went, and Charlie, this is sort of the funny part. Charlie said to me, "You tell Judge Churchill that if the government will quit, I will quit, and we'll call this thing a draw, and we'll all go home." And of course, I went back and told Judge Churchill that, and everybody laughed. And so we went out to cross-examine Arthur Brandon. Now, Arthur Brandon was a little black man, probably in his 60s then.
Very distinguished.
And very
Carried
distinguished
himself.
guy, sort of head of the black neighborhoods, if you will. I mean, you can sort of see that kind of guy. And he'd been the head janitor at the Capitol when all this happened, but he lost his job, obviously. And the FBI had gotten him a job at the Nashville Electric System. And during this whole investigation, Arthur had testified in front of about 3 grand juries. And so when he got on the stand, you know, I didn't want to just out and out attack him, because he, you know, you don't attack women or a man of color,
senior
older
citizens.
man. Yeah, senior citizen. So we sort of circled with Arthur a little bit, but Arthur, and I said to him, now, he couldn't read or write. But I said, "Now, Mr. Brandon, I know you can't read or write, and I'm not trying to hurt your feelings or anything, but there's one thing you can do, and you can count money." "Oh, yes, sir, I can count money." Well, he had testified on 3 different occasions, 3 different ways, about who he'd given the money to, and how much money it was, and how much, what if any, he had kept. And of course, he told the jury he'd kept none of it, you know. And I proceeded to stick those 3 grand jury testimonies up his ass. And when Arthur Brandon walked off the stand, Judge Churchill was in a different mood, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
And Charlie, I walked back to the table, and you said to me, he said, "How'd you do that?" And I said, well, hell, I read the grand jury transcript.
Well, you'd never discussed that with me because we didn't think he was ever going to be a factor because I knew I'd never talked to the guy. You know, I'd see him always occasionally, but so basically, it was my understanding he and Eddie must have had something going on. I'm not saying they did. So he just basically took Eddie out of the equation since he had pled guilty and inserted my name into the slot, you know. And I told him, I said, he's lying. Now, that's all I can tell you. He's lying. I can't prove it, but he's lying. And he already had him. He had that grand jury.
I knew I was going to nail him. And so we went from there to, what else?
That was about it.
Oh, I know.
I mean, that's when the bell rang, as far as I was concerned.
Remember when the government rested their case, and we had a weekend off, and Charlie and I were in Nashville, and we went out to Centennial Park. Remember that? And we had this huge argument about whether or not you were going to testify.
Oh, okay.
And Charlie didn't want to testify, and I said,
No,
God damn it,
I didn't.
You've got to testify. If you don't testify, we're just dead in the water. So he agreed, and on direct examination, Charlie did wonderfully. And he was on direct for about 2 hours. And so the government started cross-examination. And Joe Brown was the assistant U.S. attorney who was really leading the case, and Joe got up, and Joe was sort of a workman-like prosecutor, and he had a big notebook, and he would ask his questions and turn the pages. And he did this for about an hour. And in that first hour, he hadn't laid a glove on Charlie. And all of a sudden, he started to ask a question, and it was like he lost all concentration. Mm-hmm. And you've seen people do this, and it takes them a few seconds and they recover. But he didn't recover. He just closed the notebook and said, no further questions. And I looked over at Hank Hillen and the FBI agents, and they were going crazy because he hadn't touched Charlie. He hadn't gotten to the meat of the thing. And I started to stand up and ask Charlie questions on redirect. And I looked at Charlie, and he just said under his breath, "Get me off here." And probably the best move I've ever made, I said, "Judge, can we have a short recess?"
Yeah.
We went out in the hall, you and I and Joe Prophet, and Charlie said, "I'm not going back on the stand." And I said, "No, you're not." And we go back in, and I walk up to the podium, and I said, "Come down, Mr. Benson. I have no further questions."
You could hear
because they could have gone back had I asked the first question, and ball game was over.
Yeah.
He missed it. He missed the pitch, and you can't do that in a.
Well, let's make this clear. You know, it wasn't like, you know, they had their opportunities.
Yeah.
Okay? Mm-hmm. They had their opportunities. That thing lasted for a long time. 8 weeks. That trial lasted 8 weeks. But all the years leading up to that, and all the witnesses they put on, okay?
80-some witnesses.
That's right. And the truth of the matter is the guy that was going to nail me was Arthur Brandon.
Yeah.
And
they missed.
Well, there was nothing to nail me with.
Right.
That's the bottom line. So I knew we were in good shape. I felt like we were, and you never know, do you? You're dealing with a jury. But I knew this: there was nowhere for them to go when you think about it. Even if I'd gone back up there, where were they going to go?
The only thing The only thing that we worried about, and actually we didn't worry, was we knew Fred Taylor would never take the stand.
No.
Against Charlie. We knew that. But during the trial, after Eddie Sisk had pled guilty, and I'm at the hotel one night,
I remember
and
this.
the phone rings.
Yeah.
And Charlie had already testified, and Eddie was drunk, and called me, and he said, "I'm going to get on the stand for tomorrow,
Yeah.
and I'm going to burn Charlie's fat ass."
Yeah.
And I got up the next morning, and I went in to see Judge Churchill and called the prosecutors in. And I said, "Look, I want to put this on the record that Mr. Sisk called me last night and said these things, and Judge Churchill let me put it on the record." And I said, "Bring him on." And
Exactly.
the government never put him
They
on.
never put him on.
I guess Arthur Brandon was the key witness, and looking back over the whole trial, was there anybody?
Well, Marie was going to be the key witness, and you took her apart. So, and then Arthur Brandon was sort of like to me, he was so far out of the loop with the testimony he came with. But the reason he did that, if you remember correctly, is that Eddie was out of the equation basically then. So he changed everything, just like you said. You never said anything about Charlie Benson
until
Eddie's gone. Eddie's gone. It was always about Eddie. So, I mean,
I can't remember. I mean, there were so many witnesses.
No,
I remember the Al Schmutzer, the state prosecutor.
That was one of the classics there. You brought him in.
I made him come.
Yes.
I subpoenaed him, and he didn't want to help us.
Mm-mm.
Obviously. And
former FBI agent.
Oh, he was. Al was right out of FBI school.
Yeah.
But when there was a guy from Newport named Eddie Rusty Denton, and this goes back to
the Red Lantern.
Yeah, when I was the first year I was practicing law in Newport, 1975, Christmas of 1975. On Christmas Eve, I was working in my little $37.50 a month office, and Roy Campbell, who had fired me, he and I had become great friends. And he called me and said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm going to work tonight, and I'm going to Chattanooga tomorrow to see my girlfriend. It's Christmas Day." And he said, "Let's go have a drink." And you know me, I'm always up for a drink. So we went to the Ramada Inn, and I parked in the parking lot and walked through the lobby of the Ramada Inn to get to the bar. And Roy parked around back. So he came in the back door. And it was packed, this little bar. And so Roy and I sat right in the middle of the bar. And Roy made the remark that it was a strange mixture of people, because all the college kids were home and all the rednecks and drug dealers were there. And I'll never forget, I'm talking to a kid named Steve Valentine, who was about 19 years old. Mm-hmm. And Jimmy Denton was there. And Jimmy was Glenn Campbell's twin. I mean, that was Jimmy's claim to fame.
It was,
he
he looked like
Glenn Campbell.
Yeah.
And So I'm talking to Steve, and we're laughing because Steve's mother, I had represented her boyfriend when they got into a fight. Now that's the kind of practice of law I did. And so Steve and I are laughing about that. And about 12 o'clock, a fight breaks out. And behind the bar, which is, hell, it's Newport. It wasn't any big deal. And I told Campbell, I said, I'm going to go home. And because I've got to get up early. So I go out through the lobby, and I'm not paying any attention to anything. And there's a guy in the lobby dressed up like a woman, got a blonde wig on, but I don't pay attention. I mean, I'm just, oblivious. I find this out later. And he was an escaped prisoner from Brushy Mountain, had been convicted of murder 10 years before, robbing a Superdollar market in Newport, and he killed this guy named Sam Overton, who was the manager of the Superdollar, who was taking the money to the bank from the Superdollar, and he killed him and robbed him, and had been sentenced, went to prison and escaped, and had come back to Newport, and the police knew he was there. They were just afraid. They were just afraid to arrest him. I mean, they were. And so, but he had come to the Ramada Inn that night to kill a kid named Overton, Larry Overton, and Billy Reese.
Yeah, Reese.
Now, Larry Overton was the son of the man he'd killed 10 years before. But Larry had grown up, and he was about 20 years old, and Billy Reese was the nephew of the man he'd killed 10 years before. But Larry and Billy were big into the cocaine drug business in Newport. And they had a competitor named Rusty Denton. And Rusty had convinced this guy that they were going to kill him because he had killed their father, and that he needed to kill them before they killed him, if that makes any sense. So he had come to the Ramada that night to kill them. They weren't there. But he didn't know that. So when the fight broke out, everybody left. And most of the crowd went to another, I told you, everybody in Newport at 12 o'clock goes to really bad bars, late night bars. And they went to this place called the Red Lantern Inn. And this guy walks in with his blonde wig on, and there's like 7 people sitting at this table against the wall, and he kills 4 or 5
of them, yeah,
with the carbine. And when he shoots them, remember, I'd been talking to a kid named Steve Valentine. Steve pulls out his gun and shoots the guy, and shoots him, and it severs this artery. And when he did that, when Steve pulled out the gun and shot this guy, Rusty Denton was standing there. He'd walked into the bar with this guy, and he shot Steve Valentine right between the eyes and killed him. Steve was 19 years old, beautiful kid. I mean, he was, he was a good kid. And so the guy that Steve had shot, that had killed all these people, gets back to the parking lot, and is dying in the parking lot. And, and there's this guy who was sitting at the bar, and all this happened while he was sitting there. His name was Ray Hicks. And Ray was so mean and so crazy. He went out and got in a car and backed over this guy's head. And when Ray testified at the trial, and he said, and I was at the trial because I was working at that point in time. Now, this is before I went to the U.S. Attorney's Office. I was working for the criminal judge. I shined his shoes, got his water, and did those kind of things. But Ray Hicks gets on the stand and testifies that he hoped that this guy was alive because he wanted to kill the son of a bitch. And it turned out the guy was already dead. The coroner testified that he was already dead. But Ray Hicks didn't care, And they convicted Rusty Denton and gave him, 160 years or
something like that.
Some ungodly amount of years. But Rusty at the trial, and you really have to go back and know the history of Cocke County. Rusty at the trial was represented by a man named Dale Quillen. Dale Quillen, who represented Rusty Denton, had been, if you remember, Dale had been an agent for the government, a revenue agent. And had gone to law school at the Nashville Y, and was a lawyer in Nashville at the time. But Dale had represented Rusty Denton's family. Mm-hmm. And Dale was a really good criminal defense lawyer. He really was. Still alive. And he's probably 90 years old.
Is he still alive? Okay.
And, but Dale was really good. But Rusty Denton's family was tied to the man who had been the circuit judge, politically tied to the man who had been the circuit judge in Cocke, Sevier, Jefferson, Granger County for 40 years.
Yes.
His name was Judge George Shepard. Well, Judge Shepard had been beaten politically when he last ran for office by then a relatively young judge named Kenneth Porter. And they hated each other. That political group, the Shepard group, hated the Porter group. And my dad was part of the old Shepard group. But I was working for Kenneth Porter at the time of this trial. And right before the trial, Rusty Denton's uncle calls me and wants the jury list, so obviously so they can fix the jury, and I wouldn't give it to him, and told Judge Porter. Now, and so when we started that trial, Judge Porter made me sit between Steve Valentine's mother and the defendant. Now, at this point in time, in courtrooms, there were no metal detectors. And Steve Valentine's mother, Martha Hicks, was the meanest white woman in the county. And I really didn't want to sit there. But Judge Porter made me sit there, and so I did. And I watched that trial. And Judge Porter he gave Dale Quillen the worst trial. He was probably right on some of the issues, but it was so openly, what's the word I want to use, antagonistic towards Dale Quillen, toward the Denton family. And there's no doubt Rusty was guilty, but it was a hard fought bitter trial. So after that, Rusty goes off to the penitentiary, and during this pardon and parole deal, and you chime in here because this is where you sort of come in, Charlie was in Nashville, and I think the Denton family approached you about, you tell it. I don't know.
No, they called to come down to see the governors, and the governor's office referred him to Eddie Sisk. Eddie Sisk calls me in and says, Charlie, what do you know about this case? I said, here's what I know. You don't want to touch this case.
Yeah.
I said, and I said, I'm from there, and so if you want to have meetings with them, that's fine, but I don't want to sit in on any meetings or anything like that. And I said, it's from a political perspective, it's something you don't want to get involved in. So that was basically my position on it. And I said, let the courts handle it. You know, and so.
But I think Eddie did meet with him.
He did meet with him, sure he did. And I, like I said, I excused myself from the meeting, went in and shook hands, and I left the room. So.
And Charlie called the local attorney general who prosecuted this case was Al Schmutzer.
Mm-hmm.
And Charlie called Schmutzer and told him, I don't have anything to do with this.
Mm-hmm.
They're trying to get him a pardon.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have anything to do with this. And we made Schmutzer come and testify to that fact.
In my trial.
He didn't want to.
Oh, he didn't want to. There was the man that spoke for all of us, and he was the senior law enforcement guy in East Tennessee, and he didn't want to tell the truth. Isn't that a shame?
He really, and I love Al Schmutzer.
And I wouldn't piss on him if he's on fire.
Yeah, I know. We disagree,
Okay.
but he did not want to come. He would not have voluntarily come and testify.
No, he wasn't going to come. You just told him he's going to either or.
Yeah.
So why should I love the bastard? Right.
We get to I guess the final argument in that case, and Charlie asked me. He said, "What are you going to say?" Do you remember that?
Go ahead. I'll probably remember it after you tell about it.
He said, "What are you going to say?" I was sitting at council table when we were taking a recess. And I said, I don't know. Get away from me and leave me alone. And the way I remember it, the prosecutors got up and argued, and Bill Cohen was the assistant. He said, ladies and gentlemen, we have shown you a football game, and I'm going to argue, and I'm going to argue the first half of the football game. And then Mr. Ball will argue, and then I will argue the second half of the football game. And when I got up to argue, I went through the trial and talked about it, and right at the end, and I was just really tired, and we had brought Chuck Benson and Alicia Benson into the trial.
That was my children.
Yeah.
They had come down with their mother
Right.
for the trial. Yeah, they were about 8 or 9 years, 10 years old.
10 years old.
She went around now.
And I said to the jury, I said, ladies and gentlemen, you know, this is not a football game. It's Chuck Benson's life. It's Alicia Benson's life. It's Marilyn Benson's life. And it's my friend's life. And I really did. I sort of lost it.
You did.
I mean, it's the only time I've ever cried in a trial, and I did, and I didn't mean to. And I turned
You're
around.
tearing up now.
Yeah.
You're getting soft in your eyes.
I am getting soft in my old age. And I turned around, and Charlie was crying. And I looked, and there were people on the front row that were crying. And these people were reporters. and I didn't think about that at the time, but there were people crying. And so I just went over and put my hand on Charlie's shoulder, and that's the way we ended the trial.
That's the way we ended right there.
And so it wasn't contrived. It was, I mean, it was just.
It was honest. It was honest.
And so the jury goes out, and they stay out for.
Well, that night we went back to our hotel. And then the next morning we got up, and it wasn't long till they called us and said, "Come on."
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. It wasn't. Maybe I don't know. They stayed out.
Yeah.
Probably 8 or 10 hours.
Yeah.
And for an 8-week trial. And
it was right about noon when we went back over there.
We had picked on the jury. We had left a guy on the jury named Mr. Matthews. And we really struggled with leaving him on the jury because he was a deputy sheriff of Wilson County. But we left him on the jury because his wife was the Democratic Party chairman of Wilson County. He was a black guy. And there was one other black guy on the jury, and you could see they had become friends during the trial. And there was this gorgeous looking woman on the jury. Oh, Jesus. She would come in every morning in these tight sweater dresses, and everybody would go crazy, and especially yours truly.
I was going to say, here I am, my life's on the line, and all he says is, "Man, she looks great today, doesn't she?" I could care less. Go to work, Gordon.
You gotta have a little sex in the trial.
Yeah, well, they were having a lot on me. They were trying to screw me to the wall.
So, you know, being the egotistical bastard that I am, I thought we had all the women vote. You know. So, anyway, so when the jury comes back, Mr. Matthews is sitting in the upper left-hand corner, and he's the foreman of the jury. So he hands the jury verdict to the bailiff, and her name was Gina, a little blonde, liked her too. And there's only 2 counts, and Charlie could have gotten 20 years on both counts. And
2 was enough. 2 counts was enough. 20 years each. Yeah.
But I knew, you know, whatever the first count was, the second count had to be the same thing. And so she hands the verdict to Judge Churchill, and he reads it and hands it back to her.
He doesn't read it out loud, though.
No, he reads it to himself.
And then he hands it
back
down
to her to publish.
I'll never forget this as long as I'm breathing.
She said, "Not guilty" on the first count. And I had a pen in my hand, and I'm sitting there, and the ceiling in the federal courthouse in Nashville, Tennessee must be 14 feet.
Yeah.
If it's an inch. And I took that pen and flipped it, and it hit the ceiling. And go ahead.
The interesting thing was, when the word got out the jury's coming back, the whole courtroom filled up. I mean, standing room only, people who worked in that courthouse, everybody was there to hear that. And then when what you said happened, not guilty, tell them what they did, they all broke out in applause.
Oh, everybody stood up and applauded. It was like Al Pacino and Justice for All.
It was
amazing.
It
really was.
Yeah.
And so Charlie and I get up, and we're dancing around the table, and Churchill is slamming the gavel.
Yeah, he's wanting order in the court.
He said, gentlemen, you've got to sit down. And he said, "I understand your exuberance, but you've got to sit down." And so I sat down, and Charlie, as I remember this, runs out of the courtroom, and they're trying Ray Blanton in the next courtroom.
I did.
And Charlie runs in and gives Ray Blanton a high five.
No, I just went in and said, "Not guilty." I tried to say, "Not guilty." And everyone was startled. You know, enough said. I mean, I don't have to apologize for that.
No,
you know what we went through. And when they lied like
tickled to
I'm
death.
not going to get in on that.
I guess the next thing I remember is that picture. I don't remember the picture,
The next
They
morning,
took
yeah,
it.
we were going back across to the hotel.
To the hotel.
Yeah.
No, well, that one. And
Yeah,
both of
there,
them.
yeah,
Both
yeah.
of them.
And the beautiful thing was, like I said, that courtroom was packed, wasn't it? The standing room only, all around the wall, and people smelled that rat. They knew Stack dead when they saw one.
It was for a year. We had been on the news every night.
Oh my gosh!
And we, after that verdict, literally we stayed. My wife was a little upset at me, but we stayed in Nashville
At night.
that night and the next night.
No, I think we came home the next day. Yeah,
Did we?
I think we did. Well, I did. We came home, I think, because I remember we went. My daughter was playing piano at the church on that Sunday morning,
Oh, really?
and we drove up, and you went with me.
I did?
Yes.
I do remember that.
Yeah.
I do remember that. But it was an interesting time.
Wonderful time.
And we later met. Helen wrote a book about the case.
A lying bastard.
Yeah.
Quote me on that one.
And we met with Helen.
Yeah, it didn't go well.
No.
And I jumped his
didn't
ass.
go well.
I told him he was a lying piece of shit.
Yeah.
He was. I mean, you know, he had his chance. He had all the resources of the United States government behind him.
He lost the case.
And he lost the case. So then he's going to go write a book and try to re-argue the case. Well, come on, give me a
Of course
break.
he did. You know.
Well, he did, but nobody paid attention to it. So I didn't really care what he did or he didn't, because the truth of the matter is, we won.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's like if you like the Volunteers, when you leave that stadium over there, if they won, everything's all right, correct?
Yeah.
There you go. We won,
Yeah.
and nobody can ever change that.
Oh, no.
And they didn't do all the threats and everything they were going to do to us. They never got around to doing it, did they? Because they knew.
There wasn't anything they could do. They asked the judge if they could go interview the jurors, and they did. And the jurors just told them, you know, they thought Charlie was innocent. They didn't prove it. So that was
That is the American way, gentlemen. Any way you cut it. That's when you have trials.
I'd much
right?
rather have a jury try my case than one person who's cynical going in.
Yeah, if we'd have listened to that judge when he brought me back after that meeting, you know, he's going to give me a break.
Yeah.
He's going to give me a break. Didn't need his friggin' break, did we? So,
And Judge Churchill.
he was a fair guy, don't get me wrong, I ain't saying that.
No.
But he was playing he wasn't the judge then. He was trying to be the arbitrator who brought me to justice,
Right.
okay? So his mind was made up. And that's not what he's supposed to be up there.
I think therein lies a huge problem with judges and is that
Who pays their salary?
who are on the bench too long, they think everybody's guilty going in, and that's not the way it's supposed to be. But I think I think jurors, we've gotten away from a fair trial and everybody's presumed to be innocent to everybody's presumed to be guilty if they're there, you know, and that's just not the way it should be.
Can I say something?
Sure.
For the camera. Gordon Ball was a young man then, and I was a young man then. We did something that really, I didn't do anything. Gordon did it all.
Yeah.
Gordon did an unbelievable job. And you know, the interesting part is he's been practicing law a long time since then. And he's done great works in the area of the law, different areas of the law. So it just tells you what a talented, bright guy he is.
That's why I brought
He's
you
a
down.
friend, and now, well, it's the truth, Gordon. I mean, you know, and so he's a friend, a lifelong friend, and I love him, and you know, it's been part of my life, and I appreciate that, and I wish him nothing but the best, and I hope this goes well for your family, and I hope this is something you pass down to them, and they know how lucky they were to have you. So,
Well, but you know, you and I've been together a long time.
Yep.
So that's
But you know,
enough said.
enough said. There you go.